Okay, let us kick off then. So we'll expect a few others to join as we go. But anyway, thank you, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have people from Australia, we have people from Chicago, and of course we have people from the UK and I'm sure other countries as well. So very welcome to you all. So my name's Sam Baker. I work with the directors of Business Declares who are on this call as well. So delighted to welcome you to this knowledge exchange. So we're running them every 2 months. It's a slightly unusual format in that we have 45 minutes on one topic. We come off, get onto the same Zoom account, but different link to get the next 45 minutes. And so at 1:15, we will close and we will reopen to talk about nature and nature's toolkit. And so please do come off this one and get onto that one at that time if you can. So we'd very much welcome you to that. So yes, as I said, I'm a strategic advisor to Business Declares and the directors, all things degrowth. I do climate fresh workshops, and I also do some of the campaigns we're involved in around ESG reporting. But what I'm here just to moderate. So what I'd like you to do, please, is stay on mute, bang in your questions into chat if and as you have them. Adam is our main man today. So just by way of introduction, so Adam Bastock, if you look at his CV, he's clearly a digital entrepreneur, what we used to call digital entrepreneur back in the day. He's got a strong streak of sustainability in there. He is a self-confessed bullshit buster, which I look forward to some of those things being busted today. But he is also founder of the iconic People Planet Pint. So many, put your hand up if you've been to one of those. I've been to lots, so I'm going to put up 2 hands. Yeah, good smattering there. So please do look out for them. That I bet you they are where you are. And if they're not, start one up. But finally, and sort of most importantly for the next 40 minutes, he is the founder of Small99. And Small99 is a resource for small and medium-sized enterprises in their quest, in their journey to get to net zero. And that is why Adam's coming to talk to us today. So as you saw, we are in the invitation. What we want to do is really sort of drill into that small and medium-sized enterprise response to a net zero ambition. So Adam, over to you. We did talk about sort of pain, pleasure, and glory. I hope there's not going to be too much pain in this. I'm really looking forward to listening in, and I will interrupt occasionally if I spot a particularly good question. And hopefully at the end, we will open up for 5 to 10 minutes of questions as well. Adam, over to you. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Sam. Brilliant intro. Yeah, so the plan for today really is that pain, pleasure, and glory. And I've tried to kind of frame this in those 3 ways. Really, what I wanted to try and highlight today is what we're seeing on the ground. So we do a lot of training and workshops with small organizations and small businesses. So I wanted just to share partly what we're seeing and also guide you through some of the content that we're delivering to give you guys a bit of a crash course in maybe what your businesses are seeing or what your business kind of community is seeing as well. So very roughly, how I've tried to do this is pain. What is coming for SMEs? What is the actual reality on the ground that we're starting to see in terms of not so much climate change? I've taken a lot of the climate change stuff out because I don't need to tell you guys that that's important, but more around legislation, supply chain pressures, etc. Pleasure, what are the benefits? How do we start telling more compelling stories to get more people on the way here? My background is in marketing, and I think marketing is the biggest thing that is missing from this transition, and that people are not selling the message well enough. And people like Alexis and Michelle Carville and Can Marketing Save the Planet, there's a lot of energy going into that. So definitely check those guys out. Glory, how can we actually start taking action and lead this? And that's the part where I might end up cutting this a little bit short based on content and timings, because it might be we've got too much depending on how questions go. And I do want to hear from you guys. So as mentioned, please do put any questions into the chat. I'll try and come to those as we go. And yeah, if I talk too quickly, then I apologize. You can probably watch this back on half speed or something. So yeah, very quickly about Small99, we do a lot of workshops and training. So we've trained about 3,000 businesses in the past 2 years. We do carbon footprints and consultancy. So we do one-to-one work as well with organizations to get their carbon footprint and, more importantly, their reduction plan together. And as mentioned, People Planet Pint. But without further ado, let's go into the pain section. Fun part is actually in Glasgow, one of our People Planet Pint events, they wrote on the board, People Planet Pain, which I quite enjoyed. So there is a theme there. Just very quickly wanted to set the scene. This is the biggest challenge we see is people not understanding what carbon neutral is and not on what net zero is. So wanted to really just bust some bullshit around that. with carbon neutral, if you've got 100 tons of your emissions and you measure your footprint to that 100 tons, you would then buy offsets equally to that 100 tons. I'm not going to open the can of worms that is offsetting right now, but typically this is how carbon neutrality works. And that there is kind of more nuance to this with something like PAS 2060, where sometimes it does require reduction. But broadly, the challenge that we're seeing in how businesses are describing carbon neutrality is that sometimes they only include carbon dioxide, sometimes they only include certain scopes, sometimes they don't actually demonstrate reduction here. That is not always the case. There are good carbon neutral standards out there, but broadly what we see is businesses throwing money at the problem here. That can be certified and it's a great stepping stone. However, it is not as kind of impactful as net zero. And we're starting to see that with some scrutiny that's coming through from the EU. So as a small business, this is the big thing that's causing a lot of fear and a lot of pain, is around stricter terms coming in from the EU on what these claims are. So things like climate positive, carbon neutral, environmentally friendly, natural, biodegradable, climate neutral, eco-friendly. These are terms that in the next couple of years are going to be under much more legislative pressure, which is going to be hitting bigger companies. But I think that fear piece is what's actually going to be filtering through to the small businesses. These kind of banning might not be the right word here, but I think scrutiny is, where the EU is going to be taking them to task a little bit on that, to say, well, actually, if you're someone like EasyJet or whoever it might be saying, oh, we're an environmentally friendly flyer, well, actually, that's not really true. Let's look at that in more detail. And there's some good examples of that going through the court right now. In terms of net zero and the impacts for a small business, if you measure your footprint to be 100 tons, then you need to demonstrate some quite drastic reductions in order to align to a net zero standard. So very roughly, it's a 50% reduction by 2030. We'll look at some examples later of how this is manifesting and people are going beyond that. Or it's a 90% reduction by at least 2050, sometimes 2045 if you are in Scotland, because Scottish government is willing never to be outdone by the English government. So there is that 90% reduction there of going, actually, we need to reduce emissions quite heavily and drastically. This typically also includes all greenhouse gases. So very rarely is it just carbon neutral. However, if you do see carbon dioxide, if you do see the term carbon net zero or net zero carbon, that's a good red flag that might only be including carbon emissions. And bearing in mind, something like methane is 35 times-ish worse than carbon dioxide. So there's some impact nuance here. Where we're seeing this manifest, though, is that net zero is driving corporates to really start looking at their supply chain and kind of shitting themselves, basically, in realizing they've signed up to a legal obligation to achieve net zero by 2050, say, and they're realizing that 95% of that footprint is actually sat within their supply chain and they're having to engage on that and decarbonize it. So this is where that biggest challenge is coming in. If we look at someone like NHS England, all suppliers need to have a kind of reduction plan or a commitment to reduction from April 2024. And they've got quite a good roadmap on their website of the different stages that's coming through and what's coming down the road in terms of product lifecycle assessments as well by 2030, I think it is. Tesco is actually one of the more ambitious supermarkets. Some good examples from them on their website as well. They started requiring a lot of their suppliers to have a net zero strategy by 2023. And that was something they announced 2 years ago during COP26. Again, just giving a Scottish example, because I am based in Glasgow, Scottish enterprise, that anyone who wants support from the government that is worth more than £10,000 needs a net zero target and a carbon reduction plan in place as of this year in order to access that. And things like council procurement documents as well, much more fragmented, but we are seeing a smattering of different councils who are building this into their tendering requirements. I think it was Eastbourne Council that have got quite ambitious targets there, but then you go across to somewhere like Brighton, it might not actually be as ambitious. So very fragmented, but it is coming in some form. So yeah, that Scottish enterprise example, net zero by 2045 is that latest date. And without that plan, you're not going to get support. In terms of what they're requiring, and apologies for the slight jargon here, but scopes 1 and 2 is a minimum. So that's kind of vehicles that are owned in energy bills, very simply. And they also do require some scope 3. So they are looking at things like business travel, commuting as well as a requirement for that. So we are starting to see that come through. As mentioned, NHS, and I can send links to this afterwards if helpful, but I'm just going to go through at speed here. 2030, we start to see restrictions coming in for NHS suppliers, and before then, we're starting to see a ramping up of these requirements. So I think for me, it's quite positive actually what is going on behind closed doors in terms of this carbon reduction plan requirement. Sadly, however, the NHS did dilute their requirements slightly this year. They did say that all procurement needed a carbon reduction plan. It has now moved, I believe, to a net zero commitment, but still good kind of sense of direction. The one that's really interesting for me and where we see the pain coming through for most small businesses is procurement. We've seen a massive uptick in workshop attendance from people requiring procurement. Microsoft, again, a good example of this. They've aligned and they require all of their suppliers to demonstrate a 55% reduction in their carbon footprint against the 2019 baseline by 2030. That is going beyond the net zero targets and requirements. And they are required to submit plans on how they reduce that, as well as monitoring progress year on year and requiring this as an annual commitment to remain part of that supply chain. Interestingly, they're also doing carbon pricing so that any new projects that are coming through are having carbon kind of taxes or carbon pricing applied to it, so that those projects that are higher carbon might end up being higher cost, even if they are a low cost, high carbon element. So they're starting to move that. In terms of what that looks like for businesses, so if you take a 2019 baseline, it's very likely that 2020 to 2022, your baseline massively reduced. I know that Will's in the room and I'm quite nervous because you've probably got much better data on this than I have, Will. But this is a very rough graph of what it might look like around that 2022. You know, it's going to be lower due to home working and shifts in behaviors, but it's probably increased up to kind of back to normal as of this year. What you're seeing roughly to meet that 55% reduction is around a 10 to 12% reduction in your footprint year on year, which I think is potentially quite difficult, but also not too scary. If you start now and chip away at it, that footprint can start being reduced and nudged away. In terms of that supply chain, so Tesco's are aligned with something called the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is a kind of corporate standard where they are requiring the kind of a commitment to this. Recently, several organizations were taken off of the Science Based Targets Initiative due to not acting on it. But the way we see it manifest is that it's not necessarily just the big suppliers that are being impacted. Someone like Tesco's will turn to the bread supplier, and these are very bad but basic examples, so their top supply chain, where it's someone like bread, that then gets passed down to the logistics supplier, who then pass it down to HR, who then pass it on to who supplies their paper supplier, and then finally the small business at the end of that, even if you're 7 or 8 steps removed from Tesco's supply chain directly, are still being impacted by this. And this is the pain that's coming, and I think a lot of businesses are oblivious to, is that they're going to they'll be required to declare carbon footprints and reduction plans, even if they're not directly supplying these corporates, due to that supply chain element. The reason why that is happening through the supply chain is if you look at Tesco's carbon footprint, 90% of it is coming through things that they sell and things that they buy. So it's a really big chunk of their emissions as an organization. If you look at running their stores, which I think most people would think is their main emissions, it's about 1%, 1.5%. So quite a minimal amount of their footprint is actually coming from the kind of the operations of Tesco's. So in terms of kind of getting a footprint, the way we see it is a little bit of a journey. Most people are at the left-hand side here where there's no measurement, and then they're going to be moving more towards that accurate piece on the right-hand side. But we're seeing that even 100% accuracy is still several years away. In the footprints that we do, we don't tend to measure all parts of scope 3 just because it's too difficult. There's 15 different subcategories here. So the journey is increasingly progressive. I'm just going to skip over this slide because I don't think it's that useful here. The main thing is that the carbon footprints do tend to go up as well. So across these 3 scopes, you are going to see an increase in this. And again, the pain point here is how do you communicate this? How do you expand on this as an organization where, for very valid reasons, your footprint is probably increasing, even if that is because you're gathering more data. And I think that's the challenge that a lot of these businesses are facing, is that more data is going to mean that you're gathering more information, right? So that brings us on to the pleasure bit, and I'm hoping that pain bit wasn't too painful. But the pleasure side of it is, how do we actually communicate this, and how do you take that journey of reduction and kind of weave it into your narrative? And there's some key problems here that we're seeing within the small business audience. And I think, again, I'm thinking of this more from, we are in a bubble in this group. It's a lovely bubble and it's great, but there's an impactful world out there who are not doing anything, and they're terrified of taking that first step. Most businesses, or most people, generally, and remember, businesses are people as well, are concerned and they do want to become more sustainable, but they don't really know what that means. And then we are facing a massive language barrier here. Most businesses have done something about sustainability. They've just not quantified it or documented it. That might be things like solar panels. It might be LEDs. It might be home working. Things like that all do count towards that, but it's documenting it. The biggest challenge we've got is that businesses are not talking about it. They do not have confidence, and therefore, and this is really where People Planet Pint comes in, is to share those stories, is people are not going to their local Chamber of Commerce meeting and talking about the things they've done on sustainability. Yet, if you buy them a pint and talk to them, they've done loads of stuff because they know it's the right thing to do. That's the barrier we're facing in terms of the systems change, is actually getting people to communicate about it because of that lack of confidence. The outcome we're seeing is that tasks feel very overwhelming and potentially impossible, and people don't believe things can be done, even though there's stories out there of small businesses doing a lot of good things. That stalls progress. And it's much easier to do nothing. And we're baking inertia into the system here of people not effectively taking the next step. And I think this is it, is that businesses have already achieved something and these impossible tasks have already been done. They just need to share their advice and we'd be in a much better position here. And I think that's the challenge to all of us, is how do we extract and share those stories? In terms of language and why it's key, well, actually, key climate language is poorly understood, and there was a great report done a few months ago by Guardian, and I can't remember who actually did the report, but there's really big gaps in what people understand what it means. And I think the challenge is, can you actually describe your products, or can businesses describe the products and services and what they're doing, especially when we see that EU kind of greenwashing concerns, that is going to be paralytic in terms of this communication piece. And therefore, there is an internal skills gap around communicating the journey that people have done and the language that they're using. A good example of this is in this report, only 47% of people were confident in defining what single-use plastics were. So that meant that over half of the kind of nation, potentially, or world are not, thank you, Sam, are not defining what single-use plastics are or unable to do so, and they're confused by that. Yet we see that 90% of people think it's important for a business to take action and to talk about sustainability, to talk about. I think that's the key thing here. Most people understand that small businesses are not perfect and are going to face challenges, much as we are in our own lives. But talking about it is the key thing in the gap here. Again, I'm always a little bit conscious of these because people buy with their wallets, not what they say to surveys, but 68% of people were more likely to buy from a company that had clear environmental strategies. So this is the communication gap, really, is, can people see the woods for the trees? Can you clearly describe the products and services and their environmental benefits? There was a great, again, another study that I've not included in here from a heat pump installing sort of a survey where about 60% of heat pump installers could not describe the benefits of having a heat pump. So of course, there's no wonder why we're slowing down and doing this, is because the people selling it don't know what they're selling. It's insane. Both business to business and business to consumer want to understand this, that there's a demand, there's a desire there. But really the challenge is that kind of inertia and that fear. So how do we tackle this, and how do you win more customers as an organization while avoiding that green hushing? And green hushing is what I would call that failure of small businesses to really respond. I think sustainability often isn't framed as a benefit to people's individual life, and don't focus on that as the pitch. So it's the whole idea of how many, we need to save the polar bears, or we need to save the Amazonian rainforest. We do. How many polar bears do you see on your way to Tesco's in terms of your daily life? None. Therefore, don't talk about it, and because no one really cares. People care about getting through their life and through their day. And I think the big issue here is sustainability is often framed as a lack of something. So if you look at going meat-free is a loss. You're losing something. Is there a better way to describe this, as such as like a Lebanese meze that happens to be plant-based, and people want to then try something new, something healthy, rather than saying, oh, we've got a meat-free menu, describe it as we've got like a Lebanese menu, or we've got a kind of a plant-based menu or something like that, which sounds a bit more interesting, and the benefits are health. And that's going to align with people's daily goals in their life much more than lowering carbon emissions are, because ultimately no one knows what carbon emissions look like and no one really cares about them. You can emit as much as you want right now and it's not going to kind of punish you. Therefore, we need to take a different strategy here. Similarly, stopping driving. I think this is one of my bugbears, is people, and I'm not a huge fan of the infrastructure around cars, obviously, but if people are talking about we need to stop driving, well, actually, that sounds like a real barrier to convenience. And therefore, from a marketing point of view, it's a terrible message to share. How do we flip that into, well, maybe you can walk to work 1 or 2 days a week? That's a 40% reduction in your commuting emissions. But actually, it's more about selling it to your staff potentially as extra exercise, extra health, especially when the weather's slightly better as it is now, and aligns to that getting fit piece. Same with don't fly. I think it's, people see don't fly and what they're actually thinking is, okay, so I just sit at home and I'm miserable all the time. Whereas if you flip that round to say, well, actually, we're going to give you longer holidays, that feels like a status gain. And therefore you're buying into an image of someone who can take a 2-week holiday to travel by train and have that luxurious life rather than it being a sacrifice of losing out that holiday. So the recommendation really is to put sustainability second. People are time and cash poor, and we're not going to reach outside of this bubble by selling sacrifice. We need to flip this and sell the gains and having a great product that happens to be sustainable. There's a great piece from Think with Google as well, which was, by integrating sustainability into existing products, brands can enhance people's lifestyles. And enhance is the key word there. Actually, we're not interrupting, we're not criticizing. We're only going to win this if we actually enhance people's lives and the language we're using. A great example for this, which really stuck with me, and I'm a big wine fan, so this is always good to kind of wedge it in, is what do you think of when you say this is a sustainable wine? For me, that suddenly feels like it's a small bunch of, eco hippies in a wine lodge somewhere making questionable quality wine that might be good. It's going to have an interesting story, but it might be a little bit, a bit odd, a bit off, a bit kind of, what's the word? A bit funky is probably the word I'd use. If you flip that round and say this is a great wine because it's sustainable, the image that I have, at least on that, is I'm suddenly thinking of solar panels on the vineyard. They've maybe got water collection. They've got practices that mean they're not using paraffin in front of the kind of the vines. Maybe they're using a different methodology there to heat it. And we're not losing anything. We are gaining something. We're gaining the fact it's a great wine, not losing the fact that it's a sustainable one. And I think the key thing to bear in mind is decisions and humans are not logical. Most marketing is illogical in terms of how it's perceived. A good example is this. You go to pick up a hire car, you're offered a Fiat 500 or a Range Rover. I would say 90% of people are going to feel much better getting into that Range Rover because that vehicle has been built to make you feel great. And we can't shy away from that fact. No one cares necessarily that is creating more emissions. Yes, they might care it's creating more pollution, but I think there is it's an intangibility here, whereas the status gain from getting into that vehicle, even though most people know that it's worse for the environment, is going to override that environmental thing. So always bear in mind that logic is a really terrible way to try and convince people to do more sustainability. A great phrase I heard recently was having data to prove, but stories to move. So with a carbon footprint, what we do is we want that carbon footprint data to actually prove why we're taking these reduction actions as a small business. But we really need stories to actually move businesses to want to have a carbon footprint in the first place. And it is about storytelling and that sustainability on top. And something that the language we're experimenting with our Small99 is that we are here to help small businesses tell their sustainability story with confidence. That happens to include carbon footprinting. It's probably going to include some other pieces as well, such as internal team training to make sure that they're confident in this. So there's a wider storytelling piece that has to be added to sustainability. We can't just focus on the data side. Very quickly, I'm just going to go through into Glory now and then wrap up in probably 5 minutes or so for questions, where I just wanted to give some examples of what we're seeing small businesses take in terms of action to reduce their carbon footprint and what is forming those stories. So we tend to avoid the scopes language because no one really understands it and it gets very technical very quickly. A business has really got 5 different areas of emissions. So energy and buildings, transport, water, which is a really key one that is a very small part of the footprint, but a huge business risk, buy and sell, so supply chain, and waste. These 5 categories make it much easier for business to understand what on earth they're actually doing in that. So I've just got some examples broken down on this. One of the big things we hear about net zero as well, though, is 90% possible. And 90% reduction in your footprint sounds pretty insane when you're sat here as a small business owner. The good news is, yes, if we look at the historical kind of tracking of the energy industry and how much coal we used even 10 years ago. So 11 years ago, the carbon footprint for 1 kilowatt hour of electricity was about 500 grams or half a kilo. And already in 2022, and I think this is actually reduced down last year, it was about 180 grams per kilowatt hour. That's a 65% reduction in 10, 11 years. What we're starting to see is if we project that and if we continue at the same pace, we're going to reduce by a further 46% by 2030. And therefore, there's a slightly cheeky message that even if businesses do nothing, their scope 2 emissions are probably going to reduce against the 2014 baseline by about 80, 90%, just from the fact that the technology is adapting. That's not to say don't do anything. That's to say that we can do this, that it is possible. A 90% reduction in 10, 15 years is a very achievable target, or at least not necessarily a very achievable target, but it is a achievable kind of goal. Another example, light bulbs, LEDs. We've been working on our new measurement tool and getting some data insights. Let me just check what we've got on here. At the minute, we've only had about 150 businesses go through it. But in terms of LEDs, we're still seeing about 25% of people say that they've not done LEDs in full. Bearing in mind that our audience is skewing towards people who are already started as well. So even though taking a 100-watt bulb, such as this one, and moving it to an LED one is a 90% reduction in energy bills, we're still seeing 25%, maybe 40% of people not doing it. So don't overlook the basics. Another key one that we really see come through as a winner here is smart plugs, to the point where we're considering selling them, or at least offering some sort of smart plug service, because it's the one thing that we take away from workshops. Even if you're in a co-working space, you can start to take control of your energy supply by using smart plugs, which then just plug in. You can get an app on your phone, you can turn it on and off, and you can measure your footprint. Changing behaviors with how those devices are used through the smart plug can save around 2/3 of that energy consumption, sorry, and therefore the associated emissions. And I think that the interesting thing for us with smart plugs is we've seen it really engage teams. So people will start to use it much more around that team engagement, and it's a way to inspire behavior change within the organization. And behavior change is the main thing we need for this, not new technology. I'm going to rattle through these quite quickly, just in conscious of time. Transport, commuting, as a quick example, again, of that reduction piece. If you've got 20 employees who are driving 3 days a week, even moving from a large petrol car like a Range Rover to a small car like a Fiat 500, even if it's petrol, can still halve your footprint. And therefore, again, it's a behavior change thing of how do we get people out of their existing big vehicles into, ideally, trains, trams, ideally an e-bike, frankly, but there are options in the middle there as well. And I think it doesn't have to be all or nothing. As mentioned, even if someone cycles to work and leaves their car at home 2 days a week, that's a 40% reduction in the footprint of commuting. So again, behavior, not technology. Cargo bikes, we're seeing these more and more in cities. These are a 96% reduction. I'm a massive fan of Zedify and what they're doing. There's a company based in London who serviced corporate buildings or businesses with heating systems. They swapped their van, a diesel van, for 2 e-cargo bikes because of the ULEZ zone. They started saving about £6,000 a year. Those bikes paid themselves back in roughly 2 years from that, and they saw operational benefits as well. Anyone can ride them, and it freed up those diesel vans for other routes. So again, it has these kind of co-benefits as an organization. I'm going to skip over that one. Water, again, just a couple of quick examples of people who are stealing the glory here. Hepworth Brewery, big fans, not least because of the Pints angle, but also they're using reed beds to capture water waste. And that gets naturally processed rather than it needing to be chemically sort of treated. And God knows with what's going on with the water companies at the minute, we need more of that resilience. And then also a secret campsite based in Sussex. They use reed beds to process any waste sewage rather than it being released into the river as well. So some good examples there. Simple things like rainwater harvesting as well may seem a bit extreme, but really, if you're a builder, why are you washing the van with drinking water? Could that not be used as like a kind of a water butt or something? We've got plenty of water, but not enough of it's being captured. So in Scotland, we almost entered drought last year in Glasgow because of the hot weather. Less than 1% of rainfall in Scotland is captured. So this is the challenge, is not that we don't have any water, it's that we don't have any infrastructure, which is a huge, again, that's a whole separate webinar. Supply chain, again, just some examples of that reduction piece. If you've got 100 people eating a veg curry or a beef curry, even if you swap the beef out for chicken, over that 100 people, that's around a 60% reduction, or you can achieve a 95% reduction if you go to chickpeas. So I saw Michelle Miles join in, thinking of like weddings as a great example here. If you're serving to 100 people, small changes in your decision making there is going to have a huge impact on that footprint. And Ben, I mean, you've done plenty of work with this kind of systems change, but banking as well. If you've got £10,000 in a HSBC account, moving that over to something like Triodos is going to have a huge impact in terms of your footprint. It's very hard to quantify that from a carbon footprint point of view, but it is still worth doing. Waste. The main thing is really what are you throwing away? So don't think about recycling. If anyone says to me that they do recycling again, I'm going to lose my mind. It's kind of, we're way beyond that. Actually, how are you using these items? How are you tracking what people are throwing away to then use circular economy? Waste is really hard to decarbonize, but even thinking about how you're using packages, are you sending packages that are appropriately sized? Are people throwing away items that could be used? Cardboard boxes, a great example. How many boxes are we throwing away and then moving companies are buying in brand new virgin grade ones? We just need to make that circular economy connect up. So just as a quick summary, I know this is quite a romp through stuff, but net zero is really complicated and technical. People are here to help. It is not that difficult necessarily. It is a process to go through, but we know what we're doing and we know what the solutions are. The difficulty part really is in telling that story with confidence, and that's where the rewards are going to be. That's where the pleasure comes in. And finally, the glory is really by taking action on that and sharing your sustainability story to win more customers. So that's the main sort of overview I would say that small businesses are facing. Two very quick calls to action before we go to Q&A. We are running a bunch of workshops across the country. So if you are looking to get more details on this or you know someone who might do, please do come and find us. We're running quite low cost get started workshops that are about between 50 and 100 quid for a 2-hour workshop, depending on venue. So very affordable, and we know that they work. If you do want more advice on carbon reduction planning or anything we've spoken about today, then do contact me on Adam at Small99. And that is it from me with 10 minutes to spare. There you go.
Oh, consummate. So yeah, do put up your hand or bang a question into the chat. But I will sort of kick off and keep an eye out for anybody putting up their hand. But Adam, you talked about sort of in the pain bit, there was a big piece about the supply chain. And I can quite understand if you're a small or medium-sized enterprise, absolutely existential if if you don't then comply with whatever it is, Tesco procurement rules, etc. Do we see a significant difference then between sort of B2B and B2C for small or medium-sized enterprise?
I would say so. And I think there's a point here with Small99, just as a, Chatham House Rules thing, whether we move towards more just looking at B2B supply chains, and that's where we actually engage people because the pain is the most. We find it quite difficult to engage B2C people because often they have quite small footprints. They might not be moving that much stuff around. And there's a question there of the impact we can have with them because they might be quite hard to get to workshops because they're busy trying to just do more stuff. So yeah, I think it's much more tangible and it's much easier for a business to business company to justify the spend on sustainability, whatever that means, when their pressure is, they can draw a direct link between that and the financial outcomes. Even when we've run workshops with small businesses who are incredibly passionate, they still care about the money. And I think that is something we need to embrace is go, look, businesses are struggling. If we can't sell this as a financial benefit, we're going to fail. And we are failing.
Got it. Somebody's asked about a good bank account, so please answer that in the chat. Anybody, if you know the answer to that. Oh, thanks, Dom. Good. So another question, Adam. Obviously, we've entitled this Net Zero. This is all about reducing that GHG footprint. What about adaptation though? And are people say, obviously we do have an international audience, but what's happening in Scotland? Are people suffering? Are they actually currently experiencing the risks that we hear about from climate change, or less so?
I think they are, and I think in a sort of good way. It's quite a bad way, but people are waking up to it quite rapidly in terms of, oh shit, if my shop's flooded and all my stock's gone and the insurance company aren't there to insure me because that's going to happen again next year, what do we do? And I think people are starting to draw those lines together. And there's two examples that stand out. It was actually in Worcestershire where we did a workshop in Worcestershire County Council, where the venue we were in, which was the county cricket club, was underwater about a week before we were due to go into it. Not all of it, obviously, but parts of it where we were looking at maybe having to cancel the workshop because of the local flooding. There's also a brewer, it was a hop merchant, sorry, that was in that workshop. And the reason why they were there was to understand the risks of climate change that are bringing to their business, because they're starting to see all of their hops fail, or the people they're trying to buy those hops from in the southeast fail because it's too hot, and they're having to shift their own kind of business networks into the Midlands where it's a little bit warmer and more resilient. So I think people are starting to realize the business impacts here of inaction, and the fact that action is often resilience, especially around things like water, which is why we include it.
Got it. Thank you. So Nick Smith, he's currently having a vegan lunch there. And Nick is asking about any indications about a Labour government and what they may or may not do around accelerating business decarbonisation.
Great question. I've basically ignored all politics for the past year on that front because I felt like it wasn't the most effective thing that I could potentially do. And so I don't really know what Labour are planning. I would hope they were probably more ambitious, but I think they might have bigger challenges ahead of them than business decarbonisation. However, if they do go ahead with things like the is it the kind of the Energy Bank or the British Energy Organization, whatever it was called, where it is more focused on scaling up the adoption of renewables, I think that would help massively. For me, it's things like what France have done. If I had a magic wand, would be solar panels on car parks. I think it just accelerates things so much quicker around small things like that they could put in place without putting any capital up. I've not yet seen that ambition from Keir Starmer's team around policy and legislation because it would seem to be disruptive. And I think we're far more cautious in the UK than somewhere like France around those disruptive things.
Got it. And just, a thumbs up for the French as well on the short.
Oh yeah, short flights.
Yeah, exactly. Phenomenal. Okay, still looking for sort of any hands or any else, but in the absence of those. So another question from his costs. So, I can imagine people going in here, as you said, because they're confused, they don't know what to do, and you've given some really good sort of suggestions of what people do. People will be concerned, obviously, about costs. So where do the costs lie for this SME? I mean, obviously it'll depend, but where do the big costs lie?
Yeah. I think big cost is probably energy. That's always a big one in terms of people feeling the pressure points. But where it comes to cost of adaptation, it's typically one in consulting services to get a footprint. That's normally a few £1,000s. And even that is probably not the biggest pain point. The biggest pain point is in time to collect that information together. And I think time's the biggest pain point that we're seeing. The financial side, it's a classic business stuff like CapEx costs for investing in new technology or new, more efficient processes and getting funding for that. One example, I was at the Wildlife Centre in Arundel last week delivering a workshop. They wanted to upgrade their windows to save the energy bills. One pane of glass was going to cost £10,000. That wasn't necessarily the biggest pain point. The pain point was getting someone to install it. They were desperate to find someone who could do retrofit and draft proofing, and the skills are not there. So I think in terms of pain, I would say that cost gets a lot of attention, and I think unduly so. Businesses are used to spending money and investing in it. You can make those arguments. Skills gap and time are the two biggest barriers.
Got it. Okay, and maybe the last question here, which is a tricky one from Suzanne. Thank you. So we mentioned degrowth at the beginning. 2 points, I guess. Systemically, we're a big fan of degrowth. We think that's part of the necessary condition to actually tackling this at an overall level. But obviously, for a small and medium-sized enterprise, it's challenging as well to meet those targets if they're growing rapidly. So any reflections on that?
Yeah, I'd preface this. I'm not an expert on the degrowth movement. I don't have a huge kind of handle on it, but I think it comes back to the communication piece, which is the most challenging thing here of going, well, actually, how many small businesses want to degrow their business or will degrow their income? How many of you guys want to degrow your income? That's what people are hearing when you say degrowth. And I think that's the real challenge here of going, I personally would quite like to grow my income because I'm earning less than I was 5 years ago when I was doing digital marketing, selling any old nonsense. So there's a challenge here of how do we engage this and how do we sell this as a gain, as a status gain piece, if we are going to engage on degrowth. But I think it needs a fundamental reprint.
So I think that's a great message. It's very much aligned to what you already said. The person who did my insulation used to work for a big company, pulled out of that company because he wasn't necessarily making enough money and he didn't have any free time. He invested in the machinery to do the foam stuff in between walls. He's employed 2 people virtually. He does an 8-hour day, does as much business as he wants or doesn't want, spends time with his children. So to your point, he's got a fantastic story around a steady state business, which pays him enough to support a lifestyle that he wants over and above the one that he did when he was working for a big company. So it's a great point you make. So important.
Yeah, it's flipping
Okay,
around, isn't it?
everybody. I think, put your hands together. Come off mute. Put your hands together for Adam. A fantastic session. Thank you very much indeed. High speed.
Thanks,
So
everyone.
you might want to play it on sort of 75% speed if you do listen back. We will disseminate that to everybody who came. And now please do join us on the other link for our next knowledge exchange around nature. But Adam, thank you so much. Really insightful and good fun as well. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.